Oh, and good evening. It's May 19th, right? 2026, and we're continuing our discussion collection in or outside the class series. This series, it follows the work of the Bible Project, guiding us as we journey through the entire Tanakh, also known as the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. But those source videos are available for your review. They're on TheDustyFeet.com, and they're in that outside the class section. Because the purpose of outside the class is simple, right? First, listen to the in-class lecture, those short overview videos. Then here, we just continue the conversation. We take the ideas that they introduce, then we zoom in, slow them down, reflect on them. We walk through them together. We want to keep these episodes on the shorter side, making it easier to follow along and to catch up on. So we are on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, walking through this sacred collection together. But we're going to do it with a bit of a different twist, a little curiosity, a candid conversation, and as always, dusty feet along the way. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you're not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. TheDustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. It's designed around the written and spoken text. It's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook at The Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. 4. And as always, you're welcome to send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. Oh, and before we move on, quick reminder, if you find these conversations useful, please click that subscribe button. That reminder, that's just for you. But if you think these series might be useful to someone else, please click the like button. Because in this series, we're walking through the entire Tanakh. We're going to follow the original order of the Hebrew Scriptures. And remember, the videos we discuss here, they're only the tip of an iceberg. They are part of a much larger learning series from the Bible Project, ones I highly recommend, and those can all be found on their app and on their website. Because along the way, we're going to ask a lot of questions. Questions about the text, people, patterns, history, choices, and what it might mean. As for the answers, well, we'll see where the path takes us. Kings, first scroll. This is our part 5, right? So in our last episode, we watched the kingdom stabilize, right? After the turbulent transition from David to his son Solomon. Hard decisions were made. Loose ends from David's reigns were tied off. Solomon had finally secured the throne. But now, the story tone changes, right? The noise, right, of the political struggle, it quiets for a moment. And we begin to see something else emerge. Not merely Solomon the ruler, but Solomon the seeker. So tonight's discussion centers around one of the most famous moments in all of Scripture, right? The moment a young king asked God for wisdom. Maybe perhaps more importantly, what wisdom might actually mean when it's seen. So let's walk into 1 Kings chapter 3 and we'll see what we see together, right? The chapter opens with a political detail that it may seem small at first. Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh, right? The king of Egypt. I think this is significant because Egypt had once enslaved Israel. We've been in the stories. For centuries, Egypt has represented oppression, power, empire, right? Worldly strength. But now, Israel's king is forming an alliance with Egypt through marriage. Now, politically, it's brilliant. Strategically, it's increased Solomon's influence and his security. But biblically, I think the moment feels uncomfortable, uneasy, yeah? Because throughout Scripture, God repeatedly warns Israel's leaders and then the kings not to rely on foreign alliances, horses, wealth, political power. So already the story begins to give us tension in a different way. Because Solomon is wise, but he's also human. He is faithful, but he's not perfect. I think the Bible is remarkably honest about that. Yeah, Scripture does not flatten people into heroes and villains. Not everybody's black and white, yeah? Because instead, I think the Scripture often shows us something more uncomfortable, right? That a person can genuinely love God and still drift into compromise. And I think that reality that we see in Scripture, I think it should humble every single one of us, because wisdom is not simply applied knowledge, right? It's not applied intelligence. Wisdom is learning how to remain aligned with God while navigating life's complicated realities. Yeah, that's difficult, especially when you toss in ego and power and they kind of enter the equation. Yeah. So the text, it takes us to the people were sacrificing in high places. So those high places, they were elevated worship sites. They were scattered throughout the land. They literally were as high as they could be in those locations. And some had originally been used for worshiping the God of Israel. We've seen that. But others, they had pagan associations. So I think the problem may not always have been the hill itself, right? I think the problem was the mixture, right? Human beings constantly, right? We drift towards blending worship with convenience, right? We do this today. We combine faith with image. We faith with personal ambition. We have faith with politics. But the heart becomes easily divided. And we see this. And then all of a sudden the chapter says this to catch us. It says, Solomon loved the Lord. I think that's an insightful statement. Yeah, because this is before Solomon was known for his wisdom. This is before the temple. This is before his fame, right? The text says he loved the Lord. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, just genuinely. So I think perhaps that's encouraging, because many believers, we wrestle with this exact same tension. We sincerely love God, but I think we still carry blind spots, compromises, immaturity, divided motives, right? Now, the Bible does not excuse those things, but yet it's also shown that God often begins working with these imperfect people long before they understand all of that themselves. So then we arrive at one of these great moments in biblical history, right? Solomon goes to Gibeon to sacrifice. Yep. And there during the night, God appears to him in a dream. So imagine the moment. Created the universe. He comes to a young king and he says, "What shall I give you?" Think carefully about that. If God asked you tonight, what would you ask for? Power, success, health, security, influence, long life, vindication over enemies? Yeah. But Solomon answers, his answer, it reveals something profound about his heart. Because at the beginning, first, he acknowledges God's faithfulness, right? His faithfulness to his dad, David, yeah. And then he admits his own inadequacy. Basically, he says, I'm only a little child and I do not even know how to carry out my duties, my responsibilities, yeah. Now, Solomon, we know he's not literally a child. This is different. This is humility speaking. Yeah. He recognizes the weight of leadership. I think that alone is wisdom-like, but many people seek authority before they understand responsibility. But Solomon sees that burden first. And then comes his famous request, right? He asks for an understanding heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. Now, some translations, instead of understanding heart, it says a listening heart. Now, I think that phrase is beautiful because biblical wisdom is not merely gaining knowledge, right? It begins with listening, right? It begins with listening to God, listening carefully, listening humbly. I think wisdom is not loud arrogance, right? Wisdom pays attention. Because we notice what Solomon does not ask for. He does not ask for wealth, doesn't ask for revenge, doesn't ask for military conquest. He asks to serve well. That response? Well, that seems to please God deeply, right? So God tells Solomon, because he did not ask selfishly, he's going to give him wisdom unlike anyone before him or anyone that's going to become after him. But then God, he also adds riches. God decides to add honor, right? There's an interesting pattern we see throughout Scripture. When people pursue God's kingdom first, other things can follow in healthier proportion. It's a promise in the covenant, remember? It also follows in the words of our Messiah. But when people pursue power first, well, I think everything else becomes distorted. Because wisdom, biblically speaking, is more about alignment, right? Seeing life differently, ordering priorities carefully, and understanding what truly matters. And I think perhaps that's why wisdom feels so rare in every generation, right? Information is abundant. We have probably more than we ever have, at least that we have access to, each of us individually. But wisdom? Wisdom requires humility. Wisdom requires patience. Wisdom requires moral clarity. And I think wisdom requires the ability to say, I might not see everything correctly yet. That kind of posture, that's increasingly uncommon, right? Our culture often rewards certainty more than understanding, noise more than discernment, reaction more than reflection. And Solomon's request reminds us, right? The deepest wisdom, it begins with dependence on God. So then we get the second half of the chapter, right? And well, that really begins the test to see if this heart is aligned. Yeah, this is what we're checking. And it contains that famous story. It demonstrates his wisdom. Yeah, so two women, they come before the king. Both have recently given birth. One baby had died during the night. Now both women claim the living one, right, belongs to them. No witnesses, no evidence, no DNA tests, right? There's no clear way to prove the truth. Well, especially then, the situation, well, appears impossible. I want us to notice something important that's going on here, right? This is the king of Israel, right? He's not merely, as the king, just dealing with military strategy, national politics, reorganizing government and society. Here, Solomon is dealing with genuine, real, human pain. And I think genuine leadership always, eventually, right, it reaches the personal level. Real wisdom must know how to handle people, grief, conflict, and truth. So these women, right? They argue before Solomon. One says she switched the babies during the night. The other one denies it. Back and forth they go. And finally, Solomon gives a shocking command. He finally says, "Bring me a sword." Picture that moment. The room must have gone almost silent, right? And then Solomon declares, "Cut the living child in two, give half to each." That sucking sound, that that collective gasp from the crowd, because at first glance, right, the statement, it sounds horrifying. But Solomon's not trying to harm the child. He is revealing the heart. Because immediately, right, the true woman, the true mother, she cries out, says, "No, no, 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 no. Give the baby to her. Only do not kill him." The other woman, she coldly responds, "Neither you nor I shall have him. Cut him in two." Solomon knows instantly, right? I suspect the crowd eventually figured it out that in an instant, what seemed ridiculous, right? It displayed the heart, the true heart of the mother. Because the real mother would rather lose her child than see him destroyed. Compassion exposed the truth. Solomon sees it, and he gives the child to the true mother. So this story, it's often taught simply as clever problem solving, the poker game, right? Learning how to do the ultimate bluff to get people to change. But I don't think so. I think it's deeper than that. With God's wisdom aligned, I think Solomon understood something fundamental about human nature. Because wisdom is not merely intellectual ability. It's an insight into the human heart, right? Because through the Bible, all through it, the heart is always the central part, right? And not emotions, but it's the core of person's desires, loyalties, even their identity. Solomon discerned truth by revealing the condition of the heart. And I think this matters because people can manipulate words, but the heart eventually becomes visible. It's visible under pressure. It's visible through sacrifice, through conflict, through testing. The truth surfaces. Our heart will display itself. And I think this is why Scripture places such emphasis on character. Talent can impress people temporarily, but character, well, that reveals who we truly are, who we really are. And then maybe the story points us forward. Just because later in Scripture, another son of David would come. That wasn't merely wise, but wisdom itself embodied, right? Yeshua, Jesus, he would also reveal hearts. Again, not through swords, but through truth. People around him were constantly exposed by how they responded to compassion, humility, forgiveness, even authority. So, look back at those interactions or forward to those interactions through this lens. Because some loved the light, others hated it. I think wisdom still does that today because truth reveals us all. So as my dad says, what does 1 Kings chapter 3 mean for us now? So perhaps first, it reminds us that wisdom might be worth pursuing above almost everything else. Because it's not simply biblical knowledge. It's not theological information. Its wisdom is aligned with God. The ability to live rightly, the ability to discern truth from illusion, the ability to respond rather than merely react, the ability to remain humble while carrying responsibility. So perhaps Solomon's prayer is one we should pray more often, right? Not make me successful, bless me, God, here's my checklist. But God, give me a listening heart, a heart that listens before speaking, discerns before judging, a heart that seeks truth more than ego, and maybe a heart soft enough to be corrected. Because wisdom without humility, well, as we're going to see, that becomes dangerous. Intelligence without moral grounding can become destructive. Because Scripture is riddled with this very thing. History has proven that repeatedly, right? Current events, they're on full display. But wisdom, anchored in reverence for God, that becomes life-giving. But there's also something almost bittersweet about reading this story. It's cheating in a sense. I mention this often. We can't help it, right? Because we know where it eventually leads. The man who asked for wisdom, he will later ignore some of that very wisdom that he asked for. This king who began with humility, he's going to later struggle with excess, compromise, divided loyalties. So maybe that too is part of the story. Maybe wisdom is not the one-time achievement, that it's a lifelong pursuit. No one graduates beyond the need for humility. No one becomes immune to drift. Perhaps the realization should keep us grounded, right? Because every generation thinks it sees clearly. Yet every generation also has its blind spots. Because I think that's why we are continually called, Scripture constantly calls us back. It constantly calls us back to God, to continually listen, to continually recalibrate, to continually ask for wisdom again. 1 Kings chapter 3 leaves us with this enduring image, right? A young king standing before God, aware of his limitations at the time, and yet he's not asking for greatness. He asks for wisdom. That request, we know that changed history, but maybe it can still change lives today, right? Because in a loud world, full of opinions, outrage, ambition, distraction, confusion, a listening heart, a seeking heart, I think that might remain still to be one of the rarest treasures that we have on this earth. Some to ponder. So in our next episode, we're going to continue deeper into this reign of Solomon. The kingdom's growing in glory. It's growing in influence. It's growing in complexity. So thanks for being with us tonight as we continue this journey through the Tanakh, the first scroll of the Kings, on the Dusty Feet.